Good afternoon. My name is Jim Cheek, and I'm a partner at Bass, Berry & Sims, and it's my privilege to have an interview with James C. Gooch, my longtime friend and partner at Bass, Berry & Sims. And Mr. Gooch, could you state your name for the record here?
Yes, I'm
Full
James,
name, please.
Full name. I'm James Cowen Gooch, C-O-W-E-N, Gooch.
And you were born?
Born in Jackson, Mississippi on December 27, 1943.
Young man.
Young man.
Yes, I think so. Tell me a little bit about your grandparents and your family history in Jackson.
Well, my grandfather on my father's side grew up in Kentucky, in Somerset, Kentucky, a small town roughly north of Salina, Tennessee. And he was, his father and grandfather were both from that area, and they were farmers. But my grandfather was one of 7 children, and most of them wound up working in the lumber business in one way or another. So my grandfather spent most of his working years as a lumber inspector. He owned a mill now and then. He worked for 2 of his brothers who had a little more success in the lumber business than he did. But that's what he was. He was just sort of a small businessman, merchant type. And my grandmother, his wife, I never knew. Her name was Mary Adams, and she was from Kentucky as well. And I think maybe her family owned a small hotel in Somerset, Kentucky. But she died probably when she was in her 30s. I think maybe of cancer. She died before I was born. And that was my grandfather. Then on my mother's side, my grandfather was he was trained as a minister, but he spent his career in teaching. He was president of a small college in West Virginia, and somewhere along the line, I think maybe have developed tuberculosis, and it was recommended to him that he move to a drier climate. So he went out to Texas and was a professor at TCU, taught both religion and philosophy, I think.
Wow.
And he had a great sense of humor. There's some written materials that I have seen that were produced when his death occurred out there. And one of them involved the story of a philosophy exam he gave, where one of the questions was, if you drop a piece of buttered bread, which side will it land on and why? So that was sort of his thing. And then his wife was also from a family of educators, and they grew up in Kentucky. So she lived with us in her later years. After her husband died in the 1930s, I think, then my parents were living in Jackson, Mississippi, and my grandmother lived in our house. She had a little living suite where we lived. And so I knew her pretty well. But she was a woman from a different time. She would have been comfortable in formal 1920 America, and she still had that same sort of demeanor as an older woman when I knew her. But she was a lovely, sweet, nice woman. My father's father I knew a little bit, but he was an older man when I was still a boy, and he died when I was about 6 or 7. I can remember playing some sort of silly children's games with him when he would visit our house, but I really didn't know him very well either. Then my parents, my father, as I say, his father had moved around from town to town looking at one different kind of lumber opportunity after another. So my father moved around a good bit as a boy and had his high school days in Canton, Mississippi, a little town that's now sort of a suburb of Jackson. It's a little north of Jackson. But one of his uncles his father's brothers, had had success in the lumber business. His name was Cecil. He lived in Memphis. And he had a company, I think, called the C.M. Gooch Lumber Company. And I think he had no children of his own. And so he looked after his nieces and nephews a little bit, the children of his siblings. And he and his wife was an educated woman who had gone to Vassar, they helped students get a college education. So they offered to help my father go to college, which he would never have been able to afford. And so they encouraged him to apply to Vanderbilt, which he did. But you had to have either 4 years of Latin, a foreign language, or 4 years of mathematics. And my father, because they had bumped around from town to town a little bit, only had 3 years of math and 3 years of Latin. So he was coached by a friend and then went to Vanderbilt and was admitted on a conditional basis, and he promptly flunked the entrance exam in a substantial way apparently, but he studied some more and passed it. But after about a year at Vanderbilt, his uncle, for whatever reason, thought my father was not paying enough attention to his work. I think my father's grades were actually pretty decent, but for whatever reason, and I'm not really sure of the story, Uncle Cecil said, well, that's the end of the financial aid. And so my father went to work. He was 20 years old at the time, or thereabouts.
So did he complete 1 year?
A year and a half, or a year and 3 months. And that was all the formal education he had. He went to work for a company called Retail Credit, which investigates credit rating for people who've applied for life insurance. And that led to taking a different post in Jackson, Mississippi, where he actually sold life insurance for about 2 or 3 years. And I think, Jim, you knew my father. I can't imagine him selling a life insurance policy to anybody.
No,
yeah. But he did that for a while, and there was an attractive group of young people in Jackson that all knew each other. And one of them was the daughter of an accountant in Jackson. And the accountant had a young man in his office who died. And so this senior accountant needed somebody to replace this person. And my father was offered that job, and that got him into the business of accounting. So,
but he had no education as an accountant.
No, he had taken one accounting course, I think, at Vanderbilt, and maybe an economics course. So he was on the job training for my father, but it was like a duck taking to water. That was really what he was born to do. And one opportunity led to another, and he joined a firm called Dick D. Quinn and Company. They were an accounting firm in Jackson, Mississippi, and Mr. Quinn was an excellent accountant with a great reputation, and that really got my father's career started. And then later, when he was in his 50s, that firm merged with Pete Marwick Mitchell, and my father had about 6 or 7 years with Pete Marwick, which he really enjoyed. He loved the opportunities and expertise that being part of a bigger institution afforded him.
So all of that was in Jackson, Mississippi?
All of that was in Jackson. My mother, her father was, as I say, a university professor at TCU, and both of her brothers were TCU graduates, and she was a TCU graduate. So it was a long history of college education in her family, and she was a smart, interesting, engaged woman. And when they moved to Jackson,
when did they meet, or when did they get married?
They got married, I can't tell you the exact year, but it was about 1933 probably. May have been a little earlier than that. And Mother had been in Texas, but she had a good friend who lived in Jackson. And the friend in Jackson said there was a job opportunity working at an ice company, if you can believe that. And Mother came over from Texas and went to work for this ice company and met my father and this other group of good friends there, and one thing led to another, and they got married and had 3 children. So Mother was busy raising children for much of her years. But she was,
Did she ever teach?
she never taught,
Yeah.
but so her skills when she worked were in the administrative assistant line. She could type, and she was smart, and she could read and write. And she was active in the community. She was president of the YWCA and active in our church, and served on various community boards, and so that was her outlet.
So tell me about your siblings. You said you
I have
had
two
three.
sisters.
Yep.
An older sister, Margaret, who lives in Boston and spent her career as a reference librarian for Tufts. She was an excellent student and graduated summa cum, I think, at TCU, and then got her PhD in English at North Carolina. But she was not born to teach. She is the worst procrastinator who has ever lived. So if you're a teacher, you've got to grade papers and do assignments, and that was
Right.
not her thing. But she wound up as a reference librarian at Tufts and enjoyed 40 years or more up there, and was very proud of her work and did a good job there. My other sister, Martha Ann, was a graduate of Rhodes College, which used to be Southwestern,
Right, in
located
Memphis.
in Memphis. And she married another Southwestern grad, and they lived in New Orleans for a good period of time. We worked for a utility there, and then they moved to Hattiesburg, where they spent the rest of their tenure, and they have 3 children who are all grown with children.
So how many, you had how many children, and did your siblings have children?
Well, Martha Ann had 3.
3.
2 are in Atlanta, and 1 is in Jackson. One's a nurse, one's a computer scientist, computer systems person, and the third is a musician. And my older sister Margaret did not marry and had no children. And I have 2 children. I have a son, James Jr., who lives in Atlanta and is a lawyer with a company called Graphics Packaging, Inc., where he has responsibility for one of their divisions, but also seems to get assigned to all of the merger and acquisition activity they have, which is a good fit for him in his career.
Right.
He's done various things. He started he graduated from Vanderbilt Law School and then went to work for King and Spalding for about 5 or 6 years, and then had other employments in between that and his current job. They have 3 children. I'm saying they. He married a girl named Tina Galbraith from Wisconsin, and she's a lawyer as well. She graduated from Michigan and was also at King and Spalding for a while. And they have 3 children. Finley, who is 11, and then Robert Davidson Gooch, who is called Bobby, and he's 7. And then Florence Davidson Gooch, Florence Madison Gooch, who is 3 and about to rule the world. So they are happy in Atlanta, and
you're a happy grandpa.
I'm a happy grandpa. And then my daughter Ann was 13 years younger than my son James, and she and her husband, she just got married this year to a man named Paul Zimmerman, and they're both attorneys, and he works for the Federalist Society in Washington. She works in the parliamentarian's office for the United States Congress House of Representatives, and she's also a Vanderbilt law grad. And we had no lawyers in our family at all till I came along.
Obviously, you've provided lots of fodder for them.
Well, maybe, but now they seem to be everywhere.
Well, tell me a little bit about your early education, which I assume was in Jackson.
It was in Jackson. I went to Power Elementary School, which was not too far from my house, maybe a mile. And in those days, you walked to and from school frequently. It was a very safe environment. It was during the years of segregation, so the white schools in Jackson, Mississippi enjoyed a substantial advantage over the schools that educated children of color. Their facilities were worse, their roads were worse, their books were worse, but in the schools that I attended, you had excellent teachers, and had good facilities. So after Power, which went through the 6th grade, I went to Bailey Junior High School for 3 years, which was right next to Power. And then right after that, I went to Murrah High School, another public school in Jackson. And all 3 of those schools you could almost cover with a blanket. They were very close together. And the Murrah High School experience was excellent. We had really good teachers and a broad curriculum and a lot of very smart students. So your peer group was fun to be with, and you learned a lot from them.
Have you been back to any reunions, and have you kept up with your classmates?
I've kept up. The answer is I've been back to reunions, and maybe 2 or 3. And when I go back, it's always fun. You see people that that you haven't seen for years. And I haven't kept up with that many of my high school friends. There may be 3 or 4 that I exchange communication with. But as you know, in those days, if you wanted to keep up with people after there was a geographical change, you needed to do it by a telephone call or a letter. And telephone calls cost money. That was calling long distance. And letters it took time and patience to write. And so it was easy to let friendships get away from you a bit. But I have some friends from those old days, and when I go back, as I say, and see people, I remember them fondly.
So do you think your early experience of living in Jackson and going to those schools had influenced or shaped your thinking about life or your profession as you have practiced it?
Well, I think clearly they do. Those are very formative years. And as I say, I felt like I got a good education in reading, writing, arithmetic. It wasn't like I was a genius, but I felt like you could get along in the modern commercial world with the basic educational skills that I acquired there. And when I went to Vanderbilt when I was a freshman and sophomore, that was the era of the civil rights movement. And Jackson had a lot of freedom rides that came through there where people were protesting, and they would come into Jackson, they would be promptly arrested and taken down to the fairgrounds, which wasn't that far from where I grew up. And they were kept in the fairgrounds overnight and then typically released the next day. But I was 18 or 19 years old.
Right.
You're young and idealistic, and it was really an eye-opening experience for me to even think about the fact that people had been discriminated against. You just weren't exposed to that much in Jackson, Mississippi. And the 2 papers were controlled by the same
right.
People, and both of them had a conservative point of view. So you weren't immediately exposed to.
So why didn't you go to the University of Mississippi?
Well, my mother in particular wanted me to go someplace else, and I wanted to get out of the state and try something different as well. And so Mother, it's not like it was today where parents are thinking of where children to go to school when they come out of the womb, they're
right.
immediately making plans. But in those days, I knew I was going to college. My sisters had gone to college. I didn't even think about whether I was going to go to college or not. It was just a sort of assumed thing. But where to go to college, there wasn't a lot of guidance about that. No guidance counselors really telling you what to do, and a lot of your peer group was going to Mississippi State or Ole Miss or local schools. But Mother wanted me to go someplace else, and my high school had sent some of its very good students to Vanderbilt in the years before my year. And so Vanderbilt, if you were looking north to school, then Vanderbilt was about as far as the horizon extended in those days. Although Mother had me apply to Harvard, which I did. Can't imagine what that application looks like today. I wrote it and sent it in. It was pretty bad, but they put me on their waiting list.
Right.
But a waiting list was, you don't want to wait, and I probably wouldn't have gotten in anyway. So, but Vanderbilt admitted me, so I wound up going to Vanderbilt, and there were 3 other fellows from my class who went to Vanderbilt as well. I have remained good friends with all of them, and they all became physicians. We all took freshman chemistry together, and while I made a pretty good grade in chemistry, I think I got an A in chemistry, I'm not sure I really learned any chemistry. And all of my lab experiments blew up and turned black after week one. So I knew that science and medicine were not in my future. My father had been an accountant. I'd worked at the auditing department of the city of Jackson, Mississippi for a while. And I liked math. I liked numbers. And so I drifted toward economics. Vanderbilt did not have a school of business at all. And if you wanted any courses that were business oriented, the closest thing they had was economics. And so I became an economics major. But I wasn't that thrilled about economics either. I enjoyed the courses I took, and I had one memorable professor that I'll describe in a minute. But I did know that if you were going, when college was over, if you wanted to do something else, you needed some sort of graduate education. I recognized that. And I could not see doing graduate work in economics. It just didn't interest me that much. And this one economics professor I had took me one day and took me over to the law school, Vanderbilt Law School.
Who was that? You remember?
His name, I'm pretty sure, was Hugh Walker. I think that's his fellow's name. He was a stereotypical college professor. He was about 50 years old and sort of wore casual clothes and a sweater and brought his dog to class and smoked a pipe and inhaled, which eventually did him in. That you can't do that for very long. But he loved his students. He loved teaching, and we loved him. And he took me over and introduced me around to Eddie
Morgan.
Eddie Morgan was there. And I'm sure Eddie didn't know who this professor was, but I went in and shook hands with Eddie Morgan and got a introduction to Vanderbilt Law School. And I think that really led me to apply to Vanderbilt. And you could, in those days at Vanderbilt, you could do what was called a senior in absentia program. So if you were a good student and your grades were good enough, you could apply to the professional schools, and this was true for both medicine and law. And if you were admitted to those schools, then you could attend as a freshman, and after you finished your first year of the professional school, if your grades were satisfactory, you received your undergraduate degree at the end of your first year of the professional school. And being young and in a hurry, that's what I wanted to do. So I applied to Vanderbilt and finished in 3 years there instead of 7.
What did you do in the summer times, in high school and in college? Did you have jobs?
Well, not many, as I recall. I think I water skied a fair amount and played around.
I heard sometime you were a pro at teaching tennis.
Well, you're my good friend who got me that job, but that story was actually in law school.
Was that in law school?
I was in law school. And you remember these days in law school, but if you were a first or second year law student, there weren't many clerking jobs available, at least from Vanderbilt students.
Not for first years, for sure.
Not for first year, and even second year, you worked and achieved a second year clerkship, but most of our class did not. We did other things. But for that year, for me, I had been hired to teach an accounting course at Vanderbilt undergraduate school, which was one of the many frauds that Vanderbilt has probably perpetuated on its students over the years. But in order to do that, I had to teach the course in the summer. And the course didn't really pay me enough to live in Vanderbilt, live in Nashville in the summer. I needed a second job. And so you and I played tennis together, as you recall. You a lot better than me, of course. But you thought I might qualify to teach tennis at Belmead Country Club, which had a tennis program that was not nearly as sophisticated as it is today. And so somehow I was reluctantly hired for that job by the chairman of the tennis committee, whose name was Joe Davis, who, Joe Davis was a sensational college athlete.
He was.
SEC tennis champion, I think, more than once.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew that I could not play tennis very well, and he really did not want to hire me for this assistant pro job at Belmead, but they couldn't find anybody else. And so I got the job. But I loved that job. I had fun that summer. I got a little better playing the game, and it allowed me to stay in Nashville and teach that course.
So while you were in law school, what was your experience? Did you have courses you liked better than others? Did you have professors you liked better than others? Did you enjoy the experience as a whole?
Your experience and mine are very similar. We had a wonderful class. It was a very congenial group of people. There were no cliques or little groups. People shared information. Pages did not get ripped out of books if you had an assignment. The class was small enough. There were about 110, I think, in our group. Very few females, I might say. There were maybe 2 or 3. Two. And so it's mostly male. And we did a lot of playing together. We played sports and basketball and tennis and touch football and just generally had a good time. But law school is a good fit for some people, and it's not so good for others. We had some people in our class who were wonderful students in undergraduate school who just didn't get it in law school. And then there were a lot of us who just seemed to take to law school well, and I think I was one of those.
Did you have any favorite professors that you liked a lot?
I had several professors that I liked a lot. One was a tax professor named Richard Strecker. And Strecker was an unusual character, but he did a good job of teaching taxation. And I think I took about 3 tax courses from him and really enjoyed that. And as I say, I'd had this interest in accounting and numbers anyway, and so tax law appealed to me very much.
So you had a rich background in academics. You taught academics, accounting, college level course. You had a rich heritage in the accounting profession, and you had an interest in tax. So where did that take you next?
Well, of course, you know the answer, but at our senior year in Vanderbilt, a lot of us were looking around for the next step. We knew, or we thought we would want to practice law, but the Vietnam War was underway and the draft was available then, and the lottery system was not. So if you were from a draft board area and you were in good health and had a decent education, chances are you were going to be called to the draft. And in Jackson, Mississippi, which is where my draft board was located, a lot of the people of color who were my age did not have good educations and were not in good health. And so the draft board had a certain quota that it needed to fill, and it was pretty clear that I was going to be drafted. So I didn't necessarily want to join the Army. I was hoping to avoid that. And at that time, they had been granting student deferments. And I had just gotten married my senior year of law school in the March of 1967. But they were no longer granting deferments for just married students. You had to have offspring, I think, before you got some sort of family deferment. But I had accepted this position at the NYU graduate tax program back in the fall.
Wasn't that a very prestigious scholarship that you got?
Well, it was a very nice scholarship. It was a teaching fellowship at NYU in their in the law school.
Was that the Root Tilden?
No.
No?
It was just the teaching
fellowship.
Teaching fellowship. So it paid tuition and some money on the side, and it was enough to allow us to go to New York for a year. And I had applied for that in the fall and had been accepted, fall of 1966. But then in the as we were graduating from law school, I got a notice from my draft board classifying me 1A and ordering me to report for a physical that I was being drafted. And the long story short, I won't go through the details of this, but I appealed that classification based upon various factors, including the fact that I'd relied upon the situation the year before, and they gave me one more year, and I was allowed to go to NYU for that next year, which was great. I got a really
You went to
good education.
NYU for LLM in taxation?
LLM in taxation, that's right. And I really benefited from that education. That was a first-rate tax program. The professors were good, and the assignments were thorough, and you just learned a lot of tax law.
Did you enjoy New York?
Yes, I really enjoyed New York a lot. Well, I really had three reasons for going to New York. One was I wanted to attend that tax program. I wanted to see New York. I was from Jackson, Mississippi, and hadn't really traveled much. And I wanted to see if the Vietnam War might be over, because Lyndon Johnson was our president, and I regarded him as the ultimate pragmatist who in '68 was going to be an election year. I was confident that we would be out of Vietnam in 1968. But in February or March of '68, the Tet Offensive occurred, and it was clear that we were not getting out, and I applied for the Army JAG the next day, as I recall.
Did you practice law at all in New York?
Well, I took the New York bar exam.
Which is a very hard bar exam.
It was a hard bar exam, but one of our classmates, who was a fellow by the name of William Bradford Reynolds, and Brad did not have a military obligation, and he had taken a job with Sullivan and Cromwell the year we had graduated. So he was already practicing with Sullivan and Cromwell, and he took the New York bar without success the first time. So he had to retake the bar. And I thought I was going to be practicing in New York. I had taken a job with Sherman and Sterling. Then my employment was supposed to start the next summer, and I knew I needed to take the bar, so I studied for the bar exam with Brad Reynolds. And that was helpful, let me just say, and somehow I passed the bar. So I was prepared, and I went to work for Sherman and Sterling, but the military obligation, I once again got classified 1A and ordered to report for a physical. And this time there was no dodging it. So in September of 1972, I entered the Judge Advocate General's Court.
Where were you based?
Based in Baltimore, Maryland for 4 years at an outpost, and I mean that sort of sincerely, called the U.S. Army Claims Service. And the U.S. Army Claims Service was a branch of the Judge Advocate General's office, which was based in Washington. But the Army Claims Service was sort of a forgotten child of the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and there were already so many uniformed personnel in Washington and not much room in the Pentagon. So the Army Claims Service was spun off to a military post where we were just a tenant on the military post. And the Judge Advocate General's Corps sort of let us alone in Washington, and the Army post sort of let us alone. It's much like General Half-Track's place in Beetle Bailey, if you've ever read that cartoon. But it turned out that there were 13 of us, 13 lawyers in that office, and about 8 of us worked in the division that handled tort claims against the Army under the Federal Tort Claims Act. So an example might be an automobile recruiter running a stop sign, a dependent showing up at a military hospital and having a difficult child delivery with problems, or a child walking on a firing range and picking up a shell and bringing it home and hitting it with a hammer and having an explosion. Just a wide variety of tort cases.
It's quite a bit different than your accounting and tax background.
That's true. I had finished NYU in 1968 and entered the Army that year. And in the next 3 or 4 years, Congress passed 3 or 4 major revenue acts, including the Tax Reform Act of '69, that basically undid all of what I had learned at NYU. But in this Army Claims Service, I worked for this unusual character who I think goes down in the most unusual character I've ever met. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Rouse. And Rouse had been in the military as a lawyer and had worked in claims his whole career, but had been passed over for promotion to full colonel and had been sent to this desert outpost of the Army Claims Service to handle tort cases. But Rouse had sobered up by this time. I never really knew him when he had any impairment at all, and was dedicated to his job and treated all of us as just associates in a law firm. There was no rank of colonel or captain or anything else. We were all just lawyers there. But he was clearly our boss, and he was the one who would direct you in the work you did. And the most valuable lesson that I ever learned, I think, in the practice of law was one he taught me, which was that it's really not about the law when you get a case, it's always about the facts. And your inclination as a young lawyer, when you get out of law school and you've taken the bar exam and you know all the rules, is if you get a problem to start looking up the law. And that was the last step in his chain of things to do. He was always about making sure that you knew every fact.
Fact, right.
Yeah.
So how did you evolve out of that position into law practice? And did you find it quite different when you...
Well, clearly. Well, I thought I was going back to Sherman and Sterling because I had been not just a summer associate. I had taken a job with Sherman and Sterling when I finished NYU. And they said, fine, go in the military. They had lots of people coming and going, so the fact that I wouldn't be back for 4 years didn't really bother them. But after I'd been in the military about 2 years, I looked around at my contemporaries from the Sherman and Sterling days who had stayed with the Army and did not have a military obligation. And most of those people had moved out of Manhattan. They were living on Long Island or places in Westchester, and they were spending a lot of time on the train, commuting to and from work, and that just didn't seem great to me, although the work I'm sure would be fascinating. The time that it took to do that work did seem unreasonable. And also, I recognized by that time it took a lot of money to live in New York City.
Had you had any children at that time?
We had one son.
So you had a child.
We had a child. James Jr. was born in 1970.
Tends to influence you.
It influences your decision. So I knew if we had a child, we could not afford to live in Manhattan, which meant we would be living out someplace. And then the other factor was I looked at the people. I knew the people who were at Bass, Berry & Sims. I had clerked for them one summer. Summer of 1967, before I went to NYU. And so I looked at the people in the firm, and those people, and you know these people, of course, but the younger people now I'm talking about included Jim Bass Jr., and Warner Bass, and Brad Reed, and Russ Morris, and Bob Walker, and you, Jim Cheek, and Charlie Ray, and Bill Osier, and John Bailey by that time, although I didn't really know John at that point. And I thought, I can't think of a better group to cast your future with than that group of people. I knew all those people. They were all smart, good people with good instincts and honest, trustworthy, and I thought that would be a better future for me.
What did you think your practice would be like?
Well, I hoped it would be tax-oriented, and Bill Berry, for whom I had done some work when I was clerking that summer in '67, had a tax practice. Now, the tax practice then was a whole lot different than the tax practice today, but I was able to do tax work. So if something came in the front door of Bass, Berry & Sims and it had the word tax in it, then I wound up doing it. And that might involve anything from corporate tax to partnership tax to retail bottlers tax to sales tax to franchise and excise taxes to pretty much anything with tax oriented.
Well, it was pretty much you and Bill Berry that were doing that work, and my recollection was that I think Bill Berry was headed predominantly toward more of an estate, will, and trust practice than a true tax practice.
That is right. And so the estate planning and estate administration areas were always a significant part of what I did, even in the years when I was doing a broader range of tax work. And over time, that's become by far the dominant area of my practice. So for the last maybe 20 or 25 years, that's been 90% or more of what I do.
Well, talk a little bit about how I think, I know your modesty precedes your actual expertise, but the degree to which you have been recognized over the last multiple decades as being one of the, if not the preeminent wills, trusts, and estate lawyer in this not only city but in Tennessee and the region. How did that reputation, how do you get that kind of reputation
Well,
over the years, you know?
Thank you for those kind remarks. But part of it is just being around long enough and being consistently engaged in the practice. But I felt like I always tried to understand the technical aspects of what I was doing. So if it's one thing to sit back and give general advice, but it needs to be based on a sound understanding of the rules and regulations that underlie the advice that you give. So I always worked hard at trying to be technically competent in those areas. And I think in those years also you're asked to give talks to various groups. Sometimes it's bar association groups. Sometimes it's mom and pop organizations. It might be the church or a ladies group or a men's club or whatever it may be. But in that group, many times are business people and other people who hear you, see your name, and become familiar with that. And then when you speak, when you are asked to speak to professional groups, you're speaking to a group of peers, and so that gives you some reputation there as well.
Well, I've often thought that the practice of estate planning, wills, and trusts is a very personal practice and requires a degree of empathy and understanding of individuals in relationship building that develops a trust. I mean, is that not part of what sets you apart from many others?
Well, I hope so. I certainly try to be that way, and you're correct that when you're talking with people in the estate planning setting or the estate administration setting, it's private and it's personal and it's confidential, and you're talking to people about their finances. The public may think they're rich, and maybe they're really not so rich, or people think that they're not rich and maybe they really are rich. So the reality, the financial reality for people's personal circumstances is part of that discussion. And so that's you have to build trust in having those conversations. And then you're also talking about their family. It may be that they're really not proud of a child that they've got, or they're concerned in some ways, or they don't like the in-laws. And if you're going to do a competent job with people in their estate planning, you need to fish out those details and then be able to help them design a plan that addresses those concerns.
So it sounds like there are really two components. One is you got to have the technical expertise, understanding what may work to further the goals of the client, but you really got, back to your Army fellow, you got to understand the facts of the circumstances that you're dealing with a lot.
That's absolutely correct. They go hand in hand, and one without the other just doesn't work.
So are there any, without naming names, but are there any situational reflections that you have over a number of years of dealing with complex families, complex situations that would be interesting for the Nashville Bar Archives?
Well, of course, that is one really frustrating thing of my practice, is that the work I do, I just can't talk about, because invariably it's private. So if you're helping large company A merged with large company B, that becomes public knowledge and the details
Right.
of those are published. I feel like there are a lot of good stories that I have in the practice, but some of those stories take too long to tell. They're events, and you certainly cannot associate names with that. I will say, as a general matter, I feel like that I've over time helped families navigate waters without litigation or other detrimental family consequences that I think maybe other people might not have been as successful.
Yeah, I've often thought that's one of your great talents, is you, again, starting with the facts and understanding not only the facts of circumstances, but the facts of personality and interest levels, and trying to bring people together. That was always struck me as something really important to your success.
Well, thank you on that. But I've always thought if you're in negotiations, whether it's with family or anybody else, you can always just say no to something. You don't have to pound your fist on the table and throw a tantrum and shake your hand and get mad and yell and say no. You can say no just as effectively without maybe burning some bridges that you're going to need to cross in order to get the project completed.
So many times you would be in situations where the IRS would be maybe auditing an estate or having issues with respect to a charitable foundation or something like that, or when you're in probate court and litigating issues that relate to family matters that people are differing about. Would you comment about how that all interrelates to the individual formative stage? This is sort of after you've given advice and then stuff happens.
Well, I think we all are generally who we are. So the person that you are, you bring to whatever situation is in front of you. And so my nature is to try to look for a solution to a problem, and without setting off a nuclear explosion. Sometimes that's impossible. There are just some times where there's a dance going on and there's certain steps that have to be taken. You can see that they're going to occur, that it's not going to end well, but nobody is going to be able to do anything about it. And so you just have to let those play out and end up how they end up. But you still don't have to, in that process, make things worse. So, you know, you mentioned about dealing with the IRS. The only sort of funny story that immediately comes to mind is we had one situation one time where a client had deducted a lot of the expenses of a pleasure craft that he owned because he was in the business of doing certain things with pleasure crafts. And the IRS had decided that this was really not a deductible expense, it was a hobby and so forth. And we were unable to resolve it at the agent level, and we go to appeals, which is the next level. And we go, and the appellate conferees are much more prone to settlement. They're objective, and their job is to settle cases. They're protecting the fisc, but they can see both sides of the story. But they also can have a sense of humor about matters. So we get into this conference room. It's a fairly large conference room, and I look around the wall, and every picture on the wall is a pleasure craft. So,
That's good.
you know, anyway, that was enjoyable.
You got settled.
We settled the case. Yes.
So talk a little bit about you started at Bass, Berry in '72, and now you're you know, coming into the 45th year, or you are in the 45th year.
46th year now.
46th year.
Yeah.
What's your reflection on your life here at Bass, Berry and Sims? How has it changed? You know, I think all the people that you mentioned earlier, Charlie Ray, Bill Ozier, you know, Mike Peake, all of those folks are still here. You're still here. I'm still here. What is your sense of why that all has occurred, both from early days to current days?
Well, in those early days when the firm was smaller, we all did everything. You know, we handled real estate transactions, went to General Sessions Court, drafted contracts, looked at acquisition agreements, believe it or not, read bond documents. We did all of these things. And so you worked with everybody. You worked with memorable people like Frank Gorell, one of the most memorable characters any of us
What
ever
was his
had.
favorite expression?
His favorite expression was, when you ever met him, it was, Frank, how are you doing? He was absolutely magnificent. That was his favorite phrase.
Remember it well.
Remember it well.
It was actually his answer to most anything that you asked him.
He was a master of the malprop, as you recall. There are many stories about him referring to things by the wrong name, including Daniel Webster's great dictionary and other stories like that. But the senior fellows, when we were just starting out, were all memorable. Woody Sims, who was a very smart lawyer, more on the business side of the practice, loved to give work out to everybody and have a general supervisor review from about 30,000 feet. So I think you told this story in your own discussion, but you would come in and there would be a pile of papers on your desk with "please handle WS." So he turned work over, but we all learned from that. You had to get in and pick up the sheet of paper and read the thing and learn about it. But I think that experience where we were all working together built a sense of community and trust. You trusted your friends and partners, and you didn't really worry that anybody was going to take advantage of.
For years, I remember the two things that stood out to me. I'd be interested in whether you had the same reflection on that. One was the coffee hour we had every day at 10 o'clock in the library. And the other was in the corporate group, we had Monday morning meetings where everybody went around person by person by person and told what they were working on and what they might be working on in the future.
Wow, well, that's because of your success in building that department quickly. The tax group remained pretty small, and I'll mention that in just a second. But you're right, the coffee break was great because everybody came in. Mr. Bass came in, and the senior partners, and lawyers from other firms, and business people from other firms businesses would drop by and share stories about real estate development in Nashville and whatever. So those were good times. And then gradually we
That was in the old American Trust
That was in the old American Trust building. We got away from that when we moved to
First
American building, that's right. So but in terms of our group, the way the community building thing that we did was that this will sound really sick, but we would take the Internal Revenue Code and go through, because we had paralegals that we relied on a good bit in our area. And so we would take the Internal Revenue Code and take certain sections and work through those sections about once or twice
How cool.
A month.
I never knew that.
And talk about all that. And the idea was to, bring everybody up to technical level so that not only the attorneys but the paralegals had this as well. And of course, the one thing, those paralegals are still here, two of them, and the one thing they've never forgiven me for is I gave them an exam one time, which did not go over real well.
Oh, gosh.
But anyway, so quickly on the group, you talked about the corporate group meeting. The personal client world, which is really what my area is now, has always been a small part of the firm. But in the early days, it was more of an integral part of the firm because the estate planning clients were also the same people that the corporate and litigation people were doing work for. As the firm has gotten bigger and we handle these great big businesses with people all spread out, more and more the estate planning group represents high net worth individuals and executives, but they may or may not be the people who are running the companies that our corporate group is
Well, we
representing.
keep hoping that you'll send some of that over to us.
Well, and we hope that you'll send
Yes,
work our way as
exactly.
well.
No.
So
That's
but
the idea.
That's the idea. But in many cases, the senior executives of these companies want lawyers who are not the lawyers in the firm that's representing the company. The idea of conflicts has become, a much bigger deal than it was in the past. So now our group is related very closely to the firm in some ways and unrelated in others. So the corporate people frequently have clients who have questions about private foundations, charitable giving, their own estate planning, whatever, and our corporate people will contact us about that. At the same time, we have executives, many times of closely held businesses, who are selling their business. And sometimes those businesses are fairly large businesses, large enough to attract the interest of our corporate lawyers, or litigation projects that will attract our litigation people. So there's still some crossover there between the groups. And from our group's perspective, it's a luxury to be part of this firm. You have incredible people and expertise that's 2 steps down the hall and a knock on the door, as opposed to making a phone call and getting an appointment and going to see somebody. And so far, the relationship between our group and the firm has been fine.
I think the firm's been very blessed with the leadership that you've provided and the legacy of Bill Berry, and you have built an incredible practice. So
Thank you.
I thank you for that. Can talk a little bit about your activities outside of the firm in terms of professional activities, personal activities, and things of that sort.
So the main professional activity outside the firm has been with 2 groups. One was the Tennessee Federal Tax Institute, and the other was with the Southern Federal Tax Institute. So I served on the boards of both of those.
Didn't you chair one or more of those?
Yes, I chaired both of those, but in truth, you sort of rotate through the offices. So if you're selected to be on the board, chances are your time will come to be the chair. And all the different offices have different responsibilities. It's not like it's just a title. There's something to do. The Southern Federal Tax Institute has about 600 registrants. It meets once a year in Atlanta for a week. And it has nationally prominent speakers that come down and speak. And the board itself has leading practitioners on the board. So my association with that group was great. I met a lot of tax professionals from around the country, both as speakers and on the board, and that was helpful professionally, and it was also interesting from a professional standpoint. And then I'm also a member of something called the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel, and that's a college of trust and estate guys around the United States. And these are generally more experienced practitioners, and the college is not that big. I don't know the exact size, but 1,500 maybe, something in that neighborhood. And it's a sensational network of people who willingly share information and technical knowledge and ideas and thoughts. And I haven't been active in that college other than just a person who's benefited from being in the college and using that as a referral source when we have clients that have estate planning or real estate or any other needs in other communities.
Well, it's a great honor to have been selected to that college as well.
Yeah, it's an honor, but I've benefited more than they have, is the way I feel.
So talk a little bit about your personal life. You married Julie, as you said, in 1967. I think I was in that wedding.
You were in that wedding, yes. Her name was Julia Wren Davidson, is her name. And she was from Nashville. Her parents grew up here and were both wonderful people. And Julie and I had the 2 children together. We had James Jr. and Ann. And Julie and I were married for almost 30 years. We just didn't quite make it. But she's a wonderful person and a good friend, and I have nothing but the highest respect for her. Um, as
time came to go different ways,
and we parted
then you met Jenny.
Yes, my current wife, as I say, is named Jenny. Her name was Jenny Lou Pruner, and her dad was Atticus Finch. I'm not kidding. This guy practiced law in Lebanon, Virginia, which is a small town outside of Abington, and Abington's a small town outside of Bristol, and Bristol's a not very big town outside of Kingsport, Tennessee. So Abington was in the country when Jenny was growing up, but her dad was a lawyer there, and he was the Commonwealth attorney, which is the equivalent of the local district attorney. But he also had a private practice, and people would pay him in turkeys and hams and leave things on his back porch. And he was of German origin, so he was a stern taskmaster for his children. And so Jenny grew up in that environment. And Jenny is a very pretty woman and very talented. And
she's an accomplished musician.
She's an accomplished musician. She's a pianist who plays weddings and church services and served as a church music director at a few churches around. And she's really great. She's also energetic. But she was married, her first marriage, actually second marriage, was to a friend of yours and mine named Jerry Smith. And you and Jerry Smith and I played a lot of basketball together.
He joined me in my breaks from law practice.
Yes, over at McGugan,
yeah,
playing basketball. And Jerry was an absolutely wonderful guy. He was from Johnson City, Tennessee, and he and Jenny had met at a church function or two.
And Jerry had a brother that was a classmate of yours,
of ours,
I think.
that's right, Lee Smith, who was a Vanderbilt law grad, that's right, in our class. So Lee and Jerry and you and I were all good friends, and Jerry married Jenny, and then Julie and I and Jenny and Jerry were all good social friends. We saw a lot of each other and partied together and played together. And then Jerry, at age 48, I think, may have been 46, I think it was 48, died unexpectedly of a heart attack.
Raking leaves.
Raking leaves in his backyard. He had no symptoms. He jogged and ran and was in perfect shape, but he had coronary artery disease and it was undiagnosed, and he died quickly. And Jenny knew that I liked music and she liked music, and so we went through, to several music things together, and suddenly we were married, and that was 20 years ago. It's been a happy marriage for both of us.
Yes, indeed. Talk a little bit about your feeling about law practice. Would you recommend, you've sired a bunch of lawyers there, would you recommend your grandchildren going into law?
I think that people should sort of follow their instincts. It's hard for me, I guess if you saw a kid and you thought that they had certain intellectual and personality traits that you thought would fit with the law, you might suggest that to them. But to just recommend law as here's something you should do if you're a high school senior, I think I wouldn't do that. I remember the old cliche that law is a jealous mistress, and it's true. The longer you're with it, you realize that you think, well, there's nothing to sitting behind a desk and talking on the telephone. That's not hard at all. But the more you deal with the responsibilities that go along with representing people and giving advice, and you realize that it's not an easy, it may not be physically as difficult as laying bricks, but it has its own sets of demands. So I think if you think you might like the practice of law and you're interested in it, then I would certainly not discourage anybody from going down that path. The practice is clearly different. Entering the practice today is different from when you and I entered the practice. So if you join Bass, Berry & Sims today, or some other large firm, your starting years in those assignments are very different from what we had. And I don't really know what they're like so much because our group is a smaller group. So if you're in our group and you're a young associate, you're talking to clients on the phone and you're maybe appearing in probate court here and there, and you're drafting documents that are going to be used that you have to think up yourself. You can't just follow a form. But I think if you think you might like it and you have a good experience in law school, I personally have loved the practice of law.
Well, how would you like to be remembered as a lawyer?
Well, as a lawyer, of course, this isn't up to you, you realize. You're going to be remembered however you happen to be remembered. But if I could suggest some things for people to think about, I would hope that they would regard me as competent and trustworthy and helpful and fun to do business with.
And I would add, and always acting as a true gentleman in the spirit of your father, who was also just a first-rate gentleman.
Thank you for those kind words, Jim.